The new Dragon Quest Infinity Strash The Adventure of Dai has just released, and after many reviews bashing the game, the question rightfully comes up, is it worth it? Well, Square Enix has put a hefty price of $60 on it, and that's quite expensive for a game with bad reviews. However, after finishing a pretty large portion of the game, I would definitely like to state, no, Infinity Strash is not a bad game, and not even close to being a disaster like some reviewers say, but it isn't the $60 Dragon Quest. I've already talked about the campaign in my first impressions video, and admittedly, the story mode of the game is where it's weakest, and unfortunately, the beginning is done so poorly that likely it is the reason so many people are scared away from Infinity Strash, since the first few hours definitely start out as typical Japanese tutorials do, with lots of handholding and extremely slow pacing. The combat is too easy and short, with many cutscenes in between that gets annoying really fast, and why, if you know the story, skipping the story recaps is highly advised. Nevertheless, once you get deeper into the game, combat gets more hectic and challenging, where you have to start using all the mechanics the game has to offer, from perfect dodges and blocks to comboing your abilities with your party members, and yes, some bosses get pretty darn challenging, and note this is just the base story mode. After finishing it, there is a challenge mode that the whole game is apparently designed around, with its grinding and character building that we'll get to later. I think one of the best parts of Infinity Strash is the amount of love that went into the monster design and the general character design of it, as if you're a DQ fan and listen and look for the details, each character and monster has excellent sound and visual design that I would say is on par with any main Dragon Quest title, and while the rest of the game is low budget, you can see a lot of love that went into making this. The story mode though isn't that long. I would say it's roughly 10 hours long if you skip all the cutscenes and dialogues, which are just flashbacks to the anime. It's roughly twice as long if you watch all of them. So I would say if the story is what you're most interested in, that's not where Infinity Strash shines, and I wouldn't recommend it then. But let's talk about instead what it does really well. As you progress through and even finish the campaign, as early as from Chapter 3, you will unlock the side dungeon called the Temple of Recollection, and I would say this is where the bulk of the game's content and enjoyment is, aside from the later challenge mode that I did not have the opportunity to try yet. The Temple of Recollection is a roguelite minigame where the large majority of spell and skill upgrades and your so-called memory bonds can be grinded and upgraded. These are your items that increase your stats and give you special powers ranging from low quality to 3-star ultimate bonds that are really exciting to acquire. The developers initially recommended to do the temple as a side content to level up for the story, but I would argue it is much more than that and is possibly a larger part of Infinity Strash than the story is. Hell, I would even say the story is just a tutorial to start enjoying the temple. So here you will be reset to level 1 each time you start a temple run, and you'll be progressing through many levels and floors, divided by magical doors that you can choose from to boost either your attack, defense, or your abilities from varying numerical choices that admittedly aren't that exciting, but I found the later levels of the temple challenging enough that I kept being engaged, and I care quite a lot about making good character builds. The more you progress the story, the more you unlock inside the temple from varying layers that look quite a lot different, with new atmospheres, monsters, and music, and also opportunities to get different and even more unique memory bonds. In my current experience, the temple is hard enough that you won't be able to complete it very early, and it will require constant grinding and several attempts to escape with your loot, since if you die you lose everything, and judging from the ability upgrades you can potentially spend dozens of hours in this temple if you want to upgrade everything, as it's definitely a traditional JRPG grind, and if you want to make different builds, it's going to be even longer. Judging from the game's achievements, it's also intended to challenge yourself inside the temple, as there's an achievement to even solo complete it, so if you like that sort of roguelite experience, you can even challenge yourself to just play with Dai or any of your favorite characters and see if you can reach the end of the Temple of Recollection. It's definitely not an easy task. As for the combat in Infinity Strash, I won't be praising it as the best action game ever. It is quite average honestly, but it does most things right, I think, to be a fun yet simple action game. The easier fights do not require any sort of thinking, but the boss fights do require precise dodges and blocks on higher levels, and some of them even force you to do them, otherwise it will result in a game over. Once you have all your party members, it's also very similar to other party-based JRPGs where you have to rapidly switch between them to make use of everyone's skills and abilities, and time them together to combo your enemies when they're broken and are most vulnerable to your attacks. And I found this part really well executed, even if simple. Despite all of that, I would say the combat of Infinity Strash also heavily relies on your progression instead, And like a traditional Dragon Quest, there is heavy emphasis on how you build your team and individual party members with their equipped memory bonds, as like I mentioned before, from the very basic to the super rare cards, there are some that drastically change the character's abilities to make them more tanky, magical damage oriented, or close physical fighters. Like I could choose to make Pop a glass cannon mage with low health but really high magic, or I could focus on the healing powers with Mam to be the ultimate party support. So all in all, I would say combat is just engaging enough on a standard action game level that isn't too hard nor too easy, but just fun enough, and the rest of the entertainment is in building your characters and grinding at your upgrades for them, so I would definitely say they expect their players to enjoy the usual grinding and farming, as there's quite a lot of that in here. So my recommendation on Infinity Strash is that if you're a huge Dragon Quest fan, I totally recommend it. I think it's a fun Dragon Quest with decent content that is mostly packed in the Temple of Recollection as a roguelite. Otherwise, I would wait for sale, but I definitely say it's not a bad game, and I was disappointed so many of the reviews were very disingenuous and skipped on lots of the game's content, where there's definitely many positives that you can clearly see if you actually play the game. But if you're looking for a large open world RPG with story and large missions and exploration, there's none of that in Infinity Strash. This is a pure action game. With that said, as much as I hate to say this, for the best experience, I do recommend skipping all of the story recap vignettes, as they are dragging the experience and only make the game look worse, when in reality it really isn't. So unless you're a die-hard fan and really enjoy them, just watch the anime instead and skip the pictures in the game to enjoy the gameplay. Whether you're going to enjoy Infinity Strash, I think depends on if you like standard action hack and slash combat that expects you to do repeating arena fights and lots of grinding for upgrading and perfecting your characters and their equipment, since most tough battles are arena fights with story bosses, and the rest of your time will be likely spent in the roguelite side content of the Temple of Recollection, gathering the best memory bonds and upgrading them that will require dozens and dozens of runs and grinding that I personally found really fun as a Dragon Quest fan. So those are my thoughts on whether it is worth to get Dragon Quest Infinity Strash or not. I think it's a pretty good game with huge potential in the future for an even better sequel, but it requires some bonus effort to look past the poorly done beginning of the game and actually look for and try out the content that is there instead of rushing to hate everything else about it. Thank you for watching, everyone. Hope this video helped you decide, and if you're looking for more Dragon Quest videos in the future, I'll cover as much as I can. Take care, and I'll see you the next time.